Welcome to the Global Titan Business Podcast, where we interview visionaries who are shaping our future. Today, we'll be talking to Mr. Julian Oteng, the CEO of Kager International Group. Kager International operates in seemingly very diverse sectors, but they have a common thread. They are focusing on shaping the future of Africans living in rural areas across Africa. They're providing energy access, they're providing food security, and much more. So we'll try to dive deeper into what Kager actually does and why did Mr. Julian think about operating in these fields that are shaping the very future of Africa. First of all, how are you, Mr. Julian?
Oh, Mohammed, I'm very well, thank you, and thanks for taking the time to speak to me today. I mean, the African continent is exciting with its youthful population, and it's largely untapped potential. And so I'm looking forward to getting cracking with you as we discuss our perspective and our journey as Kager Group.
So, when we talk about Kager International Group, it works from energy, fintech, high-tech, value agriculture, and all of that have a common thread where they're helping push up and basically create opportunities for underprivileged people across Africa. So, what was the core vision or strategic thread that you thought would be the would connect these investments and actually promote not only business but also helping empower people in Africa?
Uh, Thanks for that, Mohammed. I think taking it down to its elemental dimension, um, energy is a fundamental requirement for any sort of industrialization or economic growth. Access to energy or access to power is equally something that should be a fundamental human right, particularly in the digital age. So, in a continent of over 1.2 billion people, the energy access is still something that is privileged. We still have almost 600 million Africans who do not have access to grid supplied power. And we can imagine what that then means downstream. These people cannot access digital information. They cannot access what has become a mainstay for us, the World Wide Web, and things as simple as that. And so, as Kager Group, we about a decade and a half ago saw an opportunity to align ourselves with what the then American government, the American administration, was looking at as how the global West could support sub-Saharan Africa, and they identified energy as one of those key pillars, and hence the formation of President Obama's Power Africa initiative. So, as Kager Group and our energy division, Zago Africa, we became a Power Africa affiliated company where we were looking to align the support that was coming from the US government, and it was quite hefty. The US government committed to $7 billion. And at the initial point of the Power Africa initiative, they managed to rally private sector interest of up to $22 billion of big energy players in America. Now, for us, as up and coming IPPs, independent power producers, we saw this co-affiliation as a great entry point to participate in the utility scale sector of energy development. Of course, on the continent, unlike in the West, a lot of the utility companies were still state-owned corporations and weren't private sector led. And so there were a lot of teething challenges with respect to integrating independent power producers onto national grid systems and operating what were historically parastatals or government corporations like private sector institutions needed to be run. And so you found that there were a lot of the grid systems did have their challenges in the sense that you were looking at pre-independence infrastructure that was still being utilized to support national power supply and protocols for integrating private entities still weren't in place. And in realizing this, the Power Africa team saw the need to recalibrate the structures of some of these state utilities. In places like Zambia and indeed to a lesser extent Kenya, we found ourselves dealing with the challenge of there being historic power purchase agreements with bulk consumers of power, such as copper mines and the likes, that were locked into tariffs that weren't cost reflective. So basically, power was being subsidized. And on the one hand, you could say that, okay, this is incentivizing the extractive sector so that their cost of production is lowered because they have cheap power. But on the other hand, that wasn't sustainable because the earnings of the utility company were too small to enable them to reinvest in new generation. And you're talking about growing populations, you're talking about industrializing countries. And it was only going to get to a certain point whereby the grid supply would not be able to be sustained by, would not be able to sustain the existing and future demand, nor would they be credible enough to be able to garner the investment for development of new infrastructure to support that increased demand.
All right. So, I mean, we were talking to Mr. Julian right now, and he gave us an understanding of what Power Africa initiative was. And on a follow-on, we'll try to understand basically, was this initiative effective? And how did that set up the foundation for energy companies to operate in Africa without the further support of the US government, considering the recent policies on the US side, which have reduced funding for such initiatives? So we'll try to understand further when Mr. Julian connects back. Mr. Julian, I think the point that we understood till this point is that Power Africa was foundational and fundamental to basically push the African energy industry in the right direction, right? With funding, resources, and research, right? Understanding the problems and putting in funding where it is needed. But recently, as we see, the funding has dried up to a limited degree with the current US administration. But the question is, how did Power Africa give African private sector power companies the foundation on which they do not need that support anymore? And just on that foundation, they can operate not only profitably, but ethically and helping people get electricity. And I think one of the aspects to that is using specific types of energy projects like solar, wind, hydro, and hybrid systems. So how is one of your companies that you invested in, Zago Africa, pushing forward on this agenda using renewables without that support, that financial support that existed before?
Thanks for that, Mohammed. First and foremost, if I can opine the following point, I believe that the current geopolitical support of the U.S. government or lack thereof is not necessarily the worst of things. And the reason is this. Ultimately, solutions that are sustainable within the continent need to be homegrown, home developed, and actually prioritized by the administrations that govern us. Aid causing complacency is a tenet that the current U.S. administration are trying to wean Africa from. And from a private sector perspective, I think that is in fact the right posture. We on the continent know what we need to do, but we do not necessarily prioritize it because we're being subsidized or supported. So it's brushed off on the priority metrics. Now, as to Power Africa's support as an accelerant, yes, indeed, there are a few things that they did through their transaction advisory team. They realized that there weren't protocols in place to enable the private sector to invest securely with utility companies. So, talking about the development of energy market protocols, talking about the development of tariffs that would enable the blend of intermittent renewables alongside baseload supplies of power from hydro and thermal sources and the likes. Now, one of the positive things about Africa's relatively slow development of the energy sector is that in most places, the primary source was largely legacy hydropower, which is intrinsically renewable. So, of course, that has had its weaknesses, particularly in the recent advent of us seeing the effects of climate change on water resources and the likes. But fundamentally, what Power Africa did was to create a roadmap that would enable private sector to get private sector based project finance to meet the demands for domestic, commercial and industrial and utility scale applications across the spectrum. Now, one of the fundamental challenges that was experienced therein is the time inertia of getting state utilities to adapt to private sector collaboration and integration. And therefore,
I think let's pick up on what you were focusing on, Mr. Julian. So, what we understand from this conversation up to this point was that Power Africa gave us the foundation where archaic utility companies were forced into some certain frameworks along with government regulations being changed. So, private companies could actually play a part in the power sector, power or energy sector in their respective countries, basically, right? And you mentioned financing,
correct.
right? it liberalized financing, so private companies could actually get financing for the projects that they might want to do. Um, Based on that, right? We just beyond generating clean power, what role does Zago see for renewables? I think as you were mentioning that most of the ecosystem is hydropower, which is a renewable. But how do you see wider renewables like solar, wind playing a part in driving broader economic development in the region?
Thanks for your question, Mohammed. From our perspective as Zago Africa, I think we realized that um, the future of grid systems were not, in fact, centralized as you have in the West, but more so distributed. And this meant that we'd be able to take generation to the load centers where they were required, where there weren't necessarily well-developed transmission and distribution networks. And therefore, we could look at microgridding, nanogridding in a complete hybridized uh, energy supply array, and incorporating renewables as as primary source of power generation, and integrating it with whatever other thermal or baseload providing power sources. We could create nodes of power generation that over time would web into a overarching interwoven grid system. And so what that then does is that it creates resilience within the grid system. Because if one node were to go down, then the rest of the grid system is functional, because you have all these generation points rather than one centralized mega supply that if that then got cut out, then you're looking at national blackouts and load shedding.
I mean, just to dig into something you said right now, Julian. So, because I think a lot of terms that you used were very, very professional. And I'm sure you know a lot about this field because, you're working in it. So, you mentioned micro and nano grids, right? Can you explain a little bit about what they are, right? How do they fit in? So, a
Yeah,
person who doesn't understand this industry can have a better idea.
fantastic, Mohammed. So let us take the example of a remote village that is hundreds of miles from um, any mainstream infrastructure. So roads, power lines, and etc. They are isolated. However, they are blessed with great solar irradiation where they are, and the population, the demand for power within that population is decently defined. And you say, rather than trying to build hundreds of kilometers of transmission lines to be able to supply them from a centralized grid, why don't we take the generation of that power to somewhere that is near where they're located? So you identify land and you build a solar PV array. Alongside that solar PV array, granted, thermal generation isn't the cleanest, but sometimes, it's what you have to deal with. So you co-locate that solar PV array with diesel, heavy fuel oil, or MFO as a backup to the solar supply. And so in that whole system, you then weave everybody into a little grid system where they have their own meters and etc. And you can charge them effectively as a utility. So you create mini utility companies that provide the end-to-end solution of power generation.
And this is
And so,
microgridding that we're talking about right now.
yes, this is it's nano and microgridding. The two are just a function of 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 uh, of scale as to what defines a nanogrid
All right.
over a microgrid, with the micro being larger than the nano. And
I've heard about another concept here related to just what you mentioned microgrids, right? So some place I read, and I could be wrong because you're the professional here, is that microgrids are individual homes producing their own power, like solar, right? And then using those the power generated at individual homes, they use what they can and they send the rest back to the main grid. Is that also microgridding, or is that something separate?
so great question. It is a component of microgridding, where you have self generation, and you're able to pump back your excess supply to a webbed grid system, or even to a national grid system. In fact, the old iterations of solar power self-generation were developed in the West, where you had a stable national grid. So if you then produced solar within your household, for instance, you actually wouldn't be consuming that power yourself. You would be getting your stable power from the grid system, and what you're generating in your house, you supply back to the national grid, and you net off. So you basically reverse meter. But in Africa, the challenge arose, and this even helped with the modification of some of the solar PV inverter systems and the likes, because they realized there's a different challenge. These inverters won't work for African solutions per se, because they intrinsically require there to be a stable grid supply of power. And if there is no supply of power on the national grid, then you cannot feed back. So they then created inverters that then were hybridized with energy storage solutions. So now not only are you generating the power, when you're generating excess, then you are charging up your battery banks that then enable you to provide yourself with the energy you need when you're not generating it, be it with a small solar power PV array, or with a small home-based wind turbine, and the likes. And now the integrated hybrid solar solutions are effectively converting your home into an end-to-end power plant. And so, as you had mentioned, on the nano and microgridding perspective, what you're then able to do is create centralized storage systems. So anybody with excess power can pump that excess power into a centralized battery bank. And that battery bank can then supply people who exist within the nano or microgrid
With the power they
with
need.
energy when they don't have. Precisely.
So I think that was actually very eye-opening, because I didn't have that understanding, and again, that is essential for anything that you do, is get that deep understanding of this in ecosystem and environment you're operating in. So let's diverge a little bit. So
Right.
we've understood a lot of microgrids, nanogrids. The question is that African ecosystem for business hasn't been friendly for a lot of people, especially in the energy space. You mentioned that at the start, that the Power Africa scheme helped governments try to be a little more friendly to the private business sector. So how do you deal with governments, local communities, and other private companies in the marketplace? How do you manage them? How do you interact with in that complex and difficult ecosystem that so that you're able to do what you want, your company has to do?
So, Mohammed, the short answer to that is you handle them patiently. Uh, Business development, business growth in Africa, I would say the key tenet would be to exercise patience and think about your business growth and development not as a sprint, but as a marathon. And take your incremental wins. Getting more specifically to how we have had to recalibrate based on some of the bureaucratic bottlenecks we've experienced over the years, was to take things down to their elemental tenets. And amongst those, we said, look, for example, it might take 2 to 3 years to develop a utility scale project. There is immediate demand for power amongst a very big population. Now, yes, it would be great to have these megawatts upon megawatts supplying hundreds of thousands of people on the one hand, but that would have to snake through the bureaucracy. Those hundreds of thousands of people still have an immediate power need. So, how do we rethink our model from B to G to C, which is basically for us as a private sector business, supplying through government grid infrastructure, and then eventually to the end user? We said, why don't we look at the end user's power needs at their individual level, and are there solutions that we could supply therein? And with that, we formed a relationship with a company called Growat, which is one of the global leaders in residential PV and hybrid systems. And we began to look at supply of power at household level. And what we found over time is, yes, these systems were small, anything between 3 and 20 kVA, but one household at a time, we found that having now done hundreds and inching into thousands of systems, the aggregated supply of power that we were being able to achieve without the bottlenecks that exist within the bureaucracies, we were actually providing a meaningful collective quantum of energy. And so we took a B2C approach and maintained the slow process of the B2G to C dimension. And our mindset was that we work bottom up as well as top down, and eventually these two strategies will meet in the middle. And when they're meeting in the middle, it means that we have played our part in improving the energy paradigm in the territories in which we operate.
I mean, so I think what I understand from this is it's about picking your battles, right? You pick the battle you can win, and you attack that certain problem from multiple angles to actually get to where you want to be.
Right, sounds good. All right. Now, Julian, you spoke deeply about, the inroads that you've made in the power sector under Kager International. But I want to shift gears a little bit here and get into the agricultural space, because from what I understand from my notes, you've done some type of investments in a company called Zamberries. And my first question is, why blueberries? And is there specific regions in Africa that are more, that are better to farm blueberries?
Thank you, George. That's again a great question, and yes, as Kager Group, we do have quite a diversified portfolio of what I would term as sectors of interest. High value agriculture being one of them. And indeed, last year we did get an opportunity to get into the cultivation of blueberries. And as to your question as to why blueberries, um, blueberries so happen to be um, one of the um, more valuable agricultural crops that one can farm. Um, for context, with respect to return to farm, 1 hectare of blueberries is equivalent to 40 to 80 hectares of maize or corn in terms of return to farm. And to your second question as to the regional components of the same, the blueberry industry is as follows. Um, Almost 80% of the market for blueberries is in the northern hemisphere of the world. And that's where blueberries originate from. They are an undergrowth bush that have naturally grown in Scandinavia, North America, and to a lesser extent, East Asia. Blueberries are considered a superfruit for a few reasons. One is the bloom, and which is the white coating that you will notice on blueberries, has very, very high levels of antioxidants. And the second and unique thing about blueberries is that it has a low glycemic index. So whilst it is a sweet fruit, it doesn't cause the sugar spike that other fruits, bananas, strawberries, etc., would cause to people who have insulin resistance or diabetics. And so that is a trait that is unique to blueberries, and the global blueberry market is expanding exceptionally. Now, whilst the northern hemisphere consumes the vast majority of blueberries, the southern hemisphere has a polar opposite season. So it means that when the northern hemisphere blueberries are out of season or out of production, then the southern hemisphere blueberries are in production. And this enables global retailers to effectively have a 52-week supply of blueberries to, say, your Walmarts, your Costco's, your Sainsbury's, your Marks and Spencers, and etc. So being located in the southern hemisphere gives us as blueberry farmers that unique opportunity to be able to supply the northern hemisphere in their off season.
Oh, wow. Very, very, excellent explanation of that. But the one thing that I've kind of heard and I've noticed about blueberry cultivation is that I've heard that it's quite a high-tech process, right? So you got to look at things like quality, yield, as well as like standards, right? Um, are you procuring this to and well, that's another question, but in procuring this, are you focusing on local markets or international markets?
Yeah, thanks for that question, George. From our perspective, as it stands currently, um, we are a 95% export business.
Mm,
Um, However, from a personal perspective, um, what excites me about blueberries and blueberry production or cultivation at scale in the southern hemisphere is a relatively new thing, and it is that northern hemisphere demand that sparked up the need to develop blueberry genetics that were attuned to southern hemisphere growing conditions. And the companies for whom we grow, United Exports and the Oz Blue varieties specifically, have been naturally bred for specific genetic traits that would speak to uh, longevity in terms of shelf life, um, size, and taste, with the most critical thing being extended shelf life. The varieties that we grow have amongst the world's longest shelf lives. And of course, that component is something that we might delve into later. It's a factor of your cold chain management
mm,
and how quickly you lower the heat index of the blueberries from the time you harvest them. But fundamentally, what it means is that we are able to harvest our berries and
yes.
actually export them globally by ship, um, rather than having to incur the added costs of air freight, and our berries will still reach the market and have the full shelf life requirement for the global retailers.
Mm,
And so, as much as these plant breeder protected varieties, such as the ones that we grow, are are considerably more costly than what we would call open varieties
mm.
of blueberries. Um, they're worth their weight in the traits that they hold that enable us to provide a quality product to the market.
Oh, wow, wow. So thanks for answering that. So it seems like there's definitely international viability that you've attacked with this particular venture, and that's great. Now, I want to speak a little more around what is it doing for the local market? You know, what are you doing, and can you speak to the contributions that you're making in that particular space in terms of, infrastructure and ancillary businesses?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question, George. There are a couple components to that. The interesting things about blueberries, and you did touch on this with your earlier question, is that it is a highly technical, highly mechanized cultivation process, but it is also highly labor intensive. And so, at basic level, um, we are using about a quarter of our developed infrastructure, and it is our ambition, of course, to get to 100% of that over the next 24 months. But even at a quarter of our installed capacity,
Yes.
um, during the picking season, our staff complement moves from 138 to almost 600 people. Now, in the African context, in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, one formal salary has the impact of having a minimum of six other individuals, and in some countries it goes up to even 10 people who are direct beneficiaries of that single source of income. So if we're talking about 600 people, and just for simplicity of maths, we take it to the higher quotient, or take it to a lower one and say every single salary is supporting 5 people. Those are already 3,000 people who are directly impacted with earnings that would have otherwise not existed. And so on a human impact level, it is quite meaningful. And then because of the sophistication of the agronomy, of the fertigation programs and the likes, it's not only low-skilled employment opportunities that our initiative supports. And then the other great component about it is that we farm sustainably, and therefore apiary management is a critical component of how we cultivate, and beekeeping, bee harnessing, and the byproducts of beekeeping, not only for pollination services, but within the health sector, talking about bee sting harvesting, talking about waxes for the cosmetic sector, and of course the honey itself being a value product. We really have a opportunity to be actively involved in farming commercially at scale in a sustainable fashion, and we see that as us playing our roles with respect to this sustainable development agenda, and indeed just as good corporate citizens, we have to protect and enhance our environment, and we are happy that we can do so at scale, and still be very alive to the sustainability elements of our farming practices.
Awesome. It definitely sounds like you're really focused on the local market, enriching the local market, and etc. Spoke on sustainability, which is, I think, very important in a developing country. But I want to ask a tough question, right?
Right.
Well, environmental and social responsibility, right? I mean, I definitely see where the kind of quid pro quo is in the side of Kager International, but where's the quid pro quo as it pertains to the environment?
Right. So number one, George, and thanks for that question, is the wars of the future are not going to be over the conventional things that are causing geopolitical turmoil. Water resources are going to be one of those things that are going to cause downstream human conflict. So managing water resources, and with our farming practices, we use microjet drip irrigation. So we give every single plant the same amount of water, the same amount of nutrition, and only as much as they need. And against our commercial benefit, because growing blueberries in the ground um, give them a longer productive life cycle. We grow in a growth medium uh, so that we eliminate any potential waste in our farming practices, and those plants will not be as viable for as long as their in-ground equivalents are. But it then does mean that on the one hand, it enables us to be quite granular in the assessment of our ECs, our MRLs, and making sure that there are no residuals that are undesirable. Given that we have blue chip customers, we undergo ethical audits, which deal with whether or not we are taking care of our staff complement properly, whether we're using the right type of interventions in terms of chemicals and pesticides. And then above that, we also go through global gap audits that equally overlay sustainable farming practices as a core tenet.
Okay. I mean, it sounds like you guys are doing some amazing things out there. I do see an overlap here as it pertains to energy and the agricultural space. Can you speak on that? Because, and also, specifically any challenges that you may be facing in that particular region, because I know, power is a big deal in those particular regions.
George, great question. This deals with part of what we were discussing with Mohammed earlier, and is a great case study for some of the challenges that are faced within the continent. In Zambia, where we grow, there has been several years of drought, and the generation pool of Zambia historically has been heavily skewed to hydropower. So whilst we and almost to the degree that 95% of the generation mix historically was hydro. Now you have dams that are at 20% of their capacity. So whilst they might have high ratings, what you call their power factor is heavily reduced. So they're only producing at, again, 20% of their capacity. Now, how does that lead into the root of your question? As a farm, we have to irrigate over 6 hours minimum every single day. And we will only get grid supplied power for 4 hours a day in the middle of the night. Now, that has a couple of challenges. Plants become dormant in the evening. So whilst it would be expedient to water and fertilize them during the hours where there is grid supply, it is suboptimal for growing practices. We need to be irrigating and fertigating them during the day when they're more vibrant. So, in the absence of power, we have to pump water from our dam, which is 5 kilometers away from our cultivation site, and then slowly supply the plants with power. So, I mean, with water and nutrients.
Yes.
Um, that then means for us that spend um, we consume over 140 liters per hour every single day for a minimum of 6 hours to fertigate up our plants. That cost of power, if we look at it at a levelized basis, goes to between 42 and 51 cents per kilowatt hour. And that would make us a lot more or a lot less competitive to our equivalents in the West or in other countries where there is stable grid supply because of our added cost of energy. Now, enter renewables. We have seen it as strategically necessary to have self-generation and set up our own microgrid that Mohammed and I were discussing earlier, so that we use solar power during the daytime, which doesn't add to the carbon footprint, and power that is available when we need it most. And then, of course, there are two parts to blueberry cultivation. The critical part is the agronomical side of cultivating it, but immediately thereafter, there is the whole cold chain management. So from the time we pick our berries, we need to get them into cold chain within an hour, because for every hour we lose by not getting their heat factor reduced, we
Based on Kager's experience, Julian, what kind of advice would you give to other investors that want to, explore like these type of impactful opportunities?
George, I would say that the key thing would be efficiency. I would tell investors to do their research quite diligently,
Mm.
and as far as possible, to try not to reinvent the wheel. Create coalitions of the willing. Pair with people who have boots on the ground. Pair with people who have paid their school fees. Don't make mistakes that others have already made. Don't walk the long way when somebody has learned that there is a more efficient route that can be used. Do your research, and find people with whom you can create synergies, and use that as your entry point. As business people, we always have this, or it's common for us to feel that we have certain unique things about the way we want to do business, or an idea that we have, and we want to protect our intellectual IP and the likes over that. But what I can say is that I've seen over time, you're stronger together, you're stronger sharing thoughts and ideas. And if your idea is good enough and your plan is robust enough, um, odds on there's nobody who's going to be able to replicate it overnight. So believe in yourself as a vision leader, and of course underpin it with sound agreements and the likes, but 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 work with people who are on the ground. That would be my 2 cents
Very.
on that matter.
No, I think that'll definitely, help some of our listeners in terms of, entering that particular market, some of the things that they need to think of, ways to look at opportunities. I think you also mentioned, not reinventing the wheel. I mean, that's very important. I think, international as well. I mean, not really reinventing the wheel. I think that's some really good advice that you gave, for our listeners. A last question for me, if you were to look out 5, 10 years ahead, right?
Right.
What would be some ambitions that you think you would have for Kager and as it pertains to the energy space as well as the agricultural space?
Well, George, for both energy and agriculture, uh, I am a huge proponent for the growth and development of the African market. There are 1.2 billion plus people here who are moving up the socioeconomic ladder. There is a very young population who have aspirations and have ambitions and capabilities to get into some of the disruptive um, uh, uh, market spheres in technology and etc. But fundamentally, Africa still has the world's largest reserves of mineral resources.
Yes.
So as governance improves, as the operational environment improves, um, my blueberry customers might cease to be those Northern Hemisphere customers and will be the upwardly mobile um, African who has gotten to a point where they have the disposable income to be able to afford things that were historically considered aspirational, but but then become their new norm, and so um, if we're talking about the digital space, the fintech arena, and others. Um, uh, uh, these are people who are going to be able to ply their professional services
Yes.
from the comfort of their villages because they have a sustainable and reliable source of power. When we look at it, when we look at the new big consumer of power, which are the data centers that we're going to have to increase the global nodes of anyway,
Exactly.
in the advent of supercomputing and the likes. Being able to do that sustainably and scalably, that is what I see as exciting. So, more specifically to your question as to where I see Kager Group and the areas in which we have looked to invest in, I see us playing an integral role in in the growth and development of of this burgeoning middle class of Africa of the future. And we're already seeing great advancements in terms of the per annum improvements in GDP across the continent. And the thing about it is looking at what those future needs are going to be and aligning our service offerings to what will be tomorrow's middle class.
I mean, it's been a very illuminating conversation, Julian. I mean, I hadn't learned as much about Africa as I learned in the past 1 hour. So, and as we were quickly wrapping up this conversation, a common theme that I've understood about Kege's philosophy and leadership principle is that all of the businesses that you're engaging in has some positive impact on the local community in empowering the people of Africa, especially those who did not have the opportunities that people in the cities might have. So, based on that, what excites you the most about the future of Kagear's impact across Africa in the coming few years?
What excites me the most is that we can show people that despite the challenges, despite everything, it can be done, and we can lead by example. And what I would wish to see is us being motivators to others to not quit and to keep up the good fight, to expose themselves to the global opportunities, to expose themselves to 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 the fact that it is possible, and to unbundle that. And Africa, if we look at certain things, mortgage uptake is at under 9%. So it means that everybody who owns a house, or 9 out of 10 people who own a house, have had to do it through savings and building slowly and etc. As our monetary markets become more evolved, as we develop credit rating systems, and this is something that we're looking at in our fintech side, and we provide people with access to affordable capital. There are so many ideas that do not see the light of day because it's only people, a small percentage, who are grandfathered into a quasi aristocracy, who can access credit facilities and etc. But when a wider pool of the economy can, then I think that the growth at large will be several multiples larger than what we're seeing at the moment. And we are heading in that direction with the Africa Free Trade Continental Area, and other initiatives that are being done with a Pan-African lens. I will tell you one of the things that I'm a big agitator for. In the United States, you can jump on a plane and fly 6 hours. You're
Yes.
you're gonna be in the same country. You're gonna use the same dollar. You will not have to snake through immigration and red tape and etc. So Africa's economic integration needs to take place. And that economic integration is driven more so by the private sector. And then the political integration follows thereafter. So stronger together.
I think this is a good point to stop our conversation on, Mr. Julian. I think you're right. Wider economic integration plus history has shown us private sector is the only force that pushes societies and regions forward. So with that, we'll wrap up our conversation, and we'll hope to learn more from you about in the future about your further ventures. With that, that's it from the Global Titan Business Podcast, and we'll see you in our next episode. Thank you.
Mohammed, George, thank you very much. Great work, guys, and blessings in your future endeavors. Please get many more people having the discussion, and I'm excited. You guys are titans in my book.